We will have a chance for questions at the end, so please prepare your questions.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the invitation, and thank you for coming. Not a very pleasant night to walk around Paris, but here is cozy. J'ai pensé au début de faire la conférence en français parce que j'ai fait des études à Paris il y a très longtemps. Mais ça c'était 70. Et puis, tous les jours, c'est l'anglais et l'espagnol. Sur le français reviennent, mais j'ai besoin d'une semaine, 2 semaines en France, et je viens d'arriver. Donc, j'ai décidé de faire la conférence en anglais, parce qu'on m'a dit, il y en a 2 traductrices, ok? Donc, on va en anglais. So, what I would like to do tonight is to chat with you, telling you what I am doing, share with you what I am doing. And because it's France, and I don't, there is not too many events in France doing the kind of things that I am doing, and I have been coming to Europe in the past 10 or 12 years, every year, sometimes twice a year, but mainly in the Netherlands and Germany, and sometimes in Spain. But France and sometimes in Italy, but Netherlands and Germany. So because of that, when I preparing my talk, I was trying to think, how shall I present what I would like to present? So in general also, I do my talk half pedagogy and half an argument. Half pedagogy, and that was my concern when I was thinking of speaking in France, because I don't know how much you in the audience, I know that some of you in the audience are familiar with what I am doing, and not only myself, but what we call the project Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality, but I didn't know whom else would be in the audience and how familiar would be with the issues I will talk about. So I prepared my presentation, my chat with you on the topic of the week, of the kind of ecology, but in my case, the coloniality of ecology and Cosmopolis, because we are in the event Cosmopolis. I prepared in 3 parts, the first, the second, and the third. And so pedagogically, I think that each part should help you to follow my argument. And not everything is clearly connected because I have a limit of time, but the 3 parts has been structured as a puzzle, so I invite you to think about how can you connect what I am not explicitly connecting to save time. Right? So without further clarification, let's move to part 1. So I will talk in my first part. The first part is about coloniality. Coloniality, decoloniality. The second part is about ecology and economy. And the third part is forget about economy and ecology. Let's talk about summa causae. So I will tell you why I will present ecology and economy as I understand decolonially what these words mean, but not to engage with them, but to disengage with them, to delink from them. So let's go to the first part and make the distinction between coloniality and colonialism, and decoloniality and decolonization. This is crucial because, I mean, decoloniality and decolonization today has become fashionable. I remember Roland Barthes when he wrote Système de la mode, il disait, le bleu, c'est à la mode cette année. And we can say that decoloniality and decolonization, c'est à la mode cette année. And I am not a judge or a police to kind of go around and see who is using it properly and who is not. That is not my business. My business is to tell you how I use it. When I talk about colonization and coloniality, what I understand, what is my kind of conceptual frame, theory, if you wish. So, let's start with decolonization during the Cold War. I will not read what is written. What is written is to help you to, so you have to work in two channels, the kind of the visual and the oral. So what was the goal of decolonization during the Cold War? What did decolonizer want? For you in France, what the Algerian want? Or those people in Indochina. Decolonization during the Cold War the goal was to send the settler home, so to send the indigenous from Europe and England home, because European and England and Britain are indigenous too, according to the definition of indigenous, belonging to the land. But the question of Eurocentrism is that made indigenous every people outside of Europe. But the question of decolonization was to send the settler home so we can build our own nation state. And that was the kiss of the dead, because the problem was the nation state. Why the problem was the nation state? Well, because when the nation state emerged in the North Atlantic, Western Europe and United States, the Glorious Revolution in England, the US Revolution, called also American Revolution, the French Revolution. What was the nation state for? The nation state kind of came out, we can say, naturally in a Europe that was being devastated by religious war. So you managed to stop that with the Treaty of Westphalia, and the Treaty of Westphalia kind of prepared the terrain for a new form of governance that was no longer aristocracy and the church, but will be something else. What was something else was the nation state. And who were the rulers and the beneficiaries of the nation state? The ruler of the beneficiary of the nation state, you may know about that, but there is a reason why I'm telling you that story. The ruler of that project was a new ethno-class. A new ethno-class that went to emancipate themselves, as Kant said on what is enlightenment, emancipate themselves from aristocracy and from the church. That ethno-class is what we call today the bourgeoisie. So that came, and the bourgeoisie, of course, was, not just appeared in the 18th century. The bourgeoisie, the merchant were coming in Europe since a long time, right? Kind of growing to the point of making revolutions in England and in France, and to structure a new form of governance. And that's fine. No, I have no problem with that. That is a European problem, and that is the way they solve it, right? The problem I have is not just with the European, but also with African and Asian, and earlier with people in Latin America. The problem I have is that these people Europe trying to implant the nation state. So the nation state is perhaps the first cosmopolitan institution from above. The nation state became the most powerful tool of political management and control, not only Europe, but of the rest of the world. So at that time, in the 19th century, we have, I don't know, probably 30 states. Now we have 190, 180. And in 1948, the United Nations was formed, suggested by the United States, but it couldn't call United States because already United States was one state, so they call it United Nations. But the United Nations was a replacement of the League of Nations, which kind of created it in 1920 after the end of the World War I. And the idea was to prevent disaster consequences like World War I and World War II. So all that was good and well for Europe, but the question is when that institution goes outside of Europe, and goes outside of Europe not because of the perverse and bad guys of Europe, but because it's also the collaborators who kind of help. And the decolonizer in that sense, what kind of collaboration in the sense that they trying to create their own nation state. So what happened when you're trying to create a nation state in India, in Algeria, in Nigeria, etc.? What happened is the following. Two things happened. Number one is that in Europe was relatively easy to make the correspondence between one nation and one state. Why? Because the nation comes from natio, right? Which is a translation of the Greek ethnos, we, nous, was relatively homogeneous. We're all white, we're all European, and we're all Christians. There were Jews, and there were Roma, and there may be some, but the majority of the nation, one state, was an homogeneous ethnicity. When you go to Algeria, you have the Pied Noir, you have the Berber, you have the Arabs. When you go to Bolivia, you have the Aymara, the Quichua, the Chiquitano, etc., etc. So one nation, one state in the colonies is a problem. And so the consequences of the Cold War of decolonization, we are seeing it now in the 21st century. Decolonization was victorious in sending the settler home, but was a failure because they kept the nation state and they couldn't, the link because the nation state was already tied to capitalism. So that was, I should have, so that is basically what decolonization meant during the Cold War, and they were kind of concerned with colonization. And colonization were a specific historical moments, like British colonization of India, French colonization of Algeria, Dutch colonization of Indonesia, etc. So they were kind of localized struggle to, again, form the nation state. To summarize that, I think that the goal of the colonization, the purpose of the colonization was summarized in 1955 in the Bandung Conference. Sukarno, in the first sentence, because he convoked the Bandung Conference, so the first sentence of his inaugural speech, that you can find it in the web, he said, I like his accent, this is the first international conference of colored people in the world. And the colored people were also religious people, were all the kind of, and he said, there are Muslims, there are Buddhists, there are Taoists, there are Confucianists, but there were no Christians. So, but the Bandung Conference set the frame of what decolonization meant at that time, and is in this kind of formula was neither capitalism nor communism, but decolonization. They didn't know exactly what decolonization was, but they knew that they want to kind of create their own nation state. And again, this was the kiss of the death, because as I will talk now, the nation state is the most powerful instrument of political control in the 500 years of Western formation and expansion. So now we move to coloniality and decoloniality. We know more or less what colonization meant and means, again, because this is not that the meaning of colonization is over, has been superseded by postmodernity. In 1990, Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano wrote a 10 pages article that became a platform of an expanding collective and project that today we know modernity, we define as modernity, coloniality, decoloniality. The article was entitled Coloniality and Modernity Rationality. And at that moment, coloniality was understood, and still understood today, as the common underlying logic of all Western colonialism since 1500. So we have Portuguese colonialism, we have Spanish colonialism, Dutch colonialism, French colonialism, British colonialism, and United States colonialism, although United States is a colonialism without colonies. But colonialism without colonies doesn't escape the underlying logic of coloniality. Coloniality of power for shorthand, but also the colonial matrix of power that I will talk in a while, that is the colonial matrix of power. So the coloniality means that monster that emerged in the North Atlantic in the 16th century and is still govern us today. Colonialism, historical colonialism has overcome, but coloniality is not. As a student of mine, a graduate student, wrote a wonderful paper, and she said, coloniality is not over, it's all over. And she was a student from Singapore who went to Oxford and then to Duke. So coloniality is all over. And I will tell you something just kind of maybe provocative, but just pedagogical, I think is useful. The colonial measure of power is the underlying logic of Western civilization. Because there is no Western civilization until the 1500s. Western civilization is an invention after the Renaissance. Greece didn't belong to the West, right? The Greek philosophers were with the back to the West. What they were looking at? They were looking at Persia. Persia was the problem. And Egypt. But the West was just a kind of the land of the barbarian, of the kind of wilderness. Nothing there, right? And Rome, well, so, you know, in high school, we know that kind of Greece, Rome, and then Heidelberg or Paris or London or whatever. But where was Christianity? Where Christianity emerged? Not in Rome, in Constantinople. That is when Constantine bring Christianity under the empire to kind of solve the problem of the empire. So that is all the story before 1500. But what happened in 1500 is a kind of radical restructuration of the world order until that time. This is a long story, but let me tell you, let me give you one case. Before 1500, the world order was polycentric. There was commerce. We know today that the kind of the Silk Road is being revamped. There was kind of commerce from Venice, and where the Venetian and the Genovese and the Florentine were getting the money. Well, were they getting the money? Because they were commerce through the Mediterranean with Timbuktu in the south, Baghdad to the Silk Road, right? But still, in the context of the existing formation, sultanates, Chinese dynasty, Sassanate, like in Persia, Europe was almost nothing, right? So the world order before 1500 was polycentric. There was commerce, but there was no one center dominating the others. Of course, there were injustice and inequalities within each center. Ça va de soi, right? But in the interstate order, it was a polycentric. What happened in 1500 is that a monster began to emerge, and that monster, through the centuries, because took at least 2 centuries, 3 centuries, emerged that monster that restructured the world order in a monocentric order, right? And that is the moment in which the idea of Western civilization began to be formed. And Western civilization is the youngest of all known civilizations. It's 500 years old, Western civilization. But a tremendous power, and it's the youngest, but it's the first civilization that encroached over all the rest. So that is why I am saying that the colonial matrix of power is, in a way, the underlying structure of Western civilization. So why underlying structure? Well, I mean, we know, I don't know, since Freud, I mean, Freud was studying the unconscious. Unconscious is not something you see, right? It's something that Freud kind of created in order to understand what you hear, which is the narrative of the patient or the analysant. So you don't see the plus value. So what Marx said, well, you know, there is no equal distribution. So there is Chomsky, well, the kind of the deep structure of the grammar, etc., etc. So in that sense, the colonial matrix of power is a type of analytic that's trying to understand the underlying logic starting from what you see. So what is the colonial, was it until 1500 was a polycentric world order. From 1500 to 2000, it's a monocentric world order. I think that the invasion of Iraq is one of the latest clear example that the kind of the monocentric decision can be taken, and if you like it, take it. If not, you don't. But that has been changed, and have been changed since 2000, because it's no longer for the West to control the colonial matrix of power that it has created. So what happened today with China and Russia and Iran is that they are not trying to get rid of the colonial matrix of power. They're disputing who manages it. So that is what I call de-Westernization. De-Westernization. So what is the colonial matrix of power? Very briefly, but I tell you something about what you see there in order to emphasize what is important for us in the colonial matrix of power. So the colonial matrix of power is formed by domains. So domains is what you see in white. So how do we identify the domains? We means the people who are working in this kind of frame, conceptual frame. The decolonial in this sense. So how do we identify this domain? Well, because are there. If you analyze what we call the rhetoric of modernity, what is the rhetoric of modernity? The rhetoric of modernity is a sentence to refer to a lot of narratives. Narrative of modernity, and postmodernity for that matter, although there are some kind of difference between postmodernity and modernity, but we are referring to the main feature of the rhetoric of modernity is a rhetoric of salvation and happiness. It's a salvation. There are 4 moments in this kind of chronological order. So the colonial matrix of power is not something like a cookie cutter that you just apply and cut. It's always moving and transforming. So we have a kind of still picture here of something that went through a lot of modification and still going through a lot of modification nowadays. I lost my train of thought now. What we call the rhetoric of modernity have 4 moments, and not once one moment comes, the other goes away. It's kind of cumulative meaning. So the first moment is salvation by conversion. That is the moment, 16th, 17th century, but also beginning of 18th century, where theology and Christianity kind of dominate the global design. So they were the neoliberal of the time, right? They have a global design to Christianize the world, right? So that was the salvation. You save yourself by conversion because either you have the wrong, you don't have religion like the Africans or the Indians, or you have the wrong religion, like Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Taoists and all this. So Christianity is the first global design where the kind of the colonial mixture of power began to be formed. The second moment is in the 18th century when France and England mainly displaced Spain and displaced theology. And that moment comes together with secularism. So we have a secular global design now that is not longer to convert the people governed by the devil, but to civilize them through progress. So progress and civilization are the 2 key words of the liberal design, global design of France and England until 1945, right? So there you go. Why the idea of the civilizing mission, that kind of reveals that this is the underlying structure of Western civilization. So this third moment, still we are talking about civilization and still we are talking about progress, but there is new concept that kind of are brought into the rhetoric of modernity and new implementation of coloniality, because the rhetoric of modernity always hides coloniality, and I will say more about this. So that third moment is when United States take over the leadership of the world from England, or from the UK. And the 2 key words at that moment, pronounced by Truman in the inaugural speech in 1949, is development and modernization. And development is still today. Except that there were problems in the 70s, economic, financial problems, and social problems, and that is long to discuss, but there are the conditions that brings neoliberalism into the picture in the 80s. So the modernization and development, in a way, failed and was replaced by a new global design, which is neoliberalism. So what neoliberalists want, and there is some confusion here where people say that China is neoliberal. See, China is not neoliberal. China is capitalist, but not neoliberal. You cannot say that capitalism and neoliberal is the same. Capitalism always was for accumulation and exploitation of labor and expropriation of land. So that's nothing new. But why is not China neoliberal? Because one of the main projects of neoliberalism was to homogenize the world, to westernize the world that the Christian already started in the 16th century. But that failed. That failed, and we see now the conflict with Iran, Russia, China is part of this. I mean, disputing the control of the colonial material. So the four domain, how do we decide the four domain? Because the four domain are extracted from the narrative of modernity. So the four domain that we extracted is knowledge, and decoloniality is the most important domain. Because if you control knowledge, you control all. And when you control knowledge, it's not that you know more about technical issues of financialization or economy or technology. The control of knowledge means the meaning you give to financialization and to technology and to economy, right? So how you convert certain technical knowledge into an ideological project of society. So that is why if you control knowledge, you control politics and you control economy. And if you control knowledge, you control subjectivity. And because you control subjectivity, you can establish hierarchy in the population. So you can manage the population in many ways, not just biopower. I mean, Foucault pointed out one of the things in a very specific moment in Europe, like he called biopower. But the colonial nature of power can manage you and us today in different forms. So one of the domain is knowledge, the other is authority, politics, and the other is the other economy, and the other subjectivity, racism, and nature. And there we can start moving into ecology. And kind of what I want to say here, three concepts were created in the rhetoric of modernity. Race, and race is not just that people belong to different, they have different DNA or different kind of culture. Race is already a racist term. There is a dictionary, Covarrubias, a Spanish dictionary of the 17th century. If you look at Raymond Williams, he doesn't have race and he doesn't have colonialism in his dictionary of keywords. Interesting, no? So in Covarrubias, he defined race, 16th century. And he said in Spanish, it is being said of horses, and he kind of elaborate on horses, and horses of pure blood. And the horses of pure blood coming from Argentina, we still talk about horses of pure blood that come from England. So race was a concept addressed to classify animals. Because socially, there was no race, there were castes, right? And after that definition, I mean, the third definition of race related to horse, Covarrubias said, it is also said of Jews and Muslims. So there you have a kind of clear example of what the narrative of modernity and controlling knowledge can do. Epistemology creates ontologies. There's no race. Race is a fiction. And you take it as a fiction, you can delink from them and just kind of say, well, let's talk about something else, but don't tell me. And so there is a long discussion here with the scientists and all these kind of things. But I think for the time being, I would say that the rhetoric of modernity, we call rhetoric not because of formality, but because of the original meaning of rhetoric among Roman rhetoricians, which is persuasion. The rhetoric of modernity persuades you, creates desire, seduce you. And that is the power of modernity. We have to recognize that, right? The seduction of modernity, right? So that we call the rhetoric of modernity, and we're trying to, so these are the four domains. But in the colonial measure of power, there is also two levels, what we call the level of the domain, which is the level of the enunciated, what is being said, and the level of the enunciation. I study semiotics, my PhD is semiotics, and I have to think in terms of semiotics. So the level that you don't see is the level of the enunciation. And Eurocentric knowledge, and Eurocentric, you know, is not a question of geography, it's a question of epistemology. It's a question of controlling knowledge. Right? So the great victory of Eurocentrism as a kind of epistemological was to hide the enunciation. And if you hide the enunciation, you hide the very geopolitic of saying. And then you can sell your knowledge as universal. Because you have cut your body and your geopolitical situation by hiding the enunciation. And you read all the great philosophers and the scientists and the theologians, and you will find out that. So the question to think decolonially is what we say, the question is to change the term of the conversation. To change the term of the conversation means to change the term that the enunciation has established as reality. And that appeared in the four domains. And one more thing. These domains are not isolated. So the colonial measure of power is a complex of domains, levels, the enunciate and the enunciated, and flows. Flows between the domain and flows from the enunciation who control all the domains. So that this is a kind of the decolonial analytic of the colonial measure of power. So that you cannot understand knowledge, the domain of knowledge, without understanding politics, economy, or subjectivities. You cannot understand races without understanding knowledge and economy and politics. So you cannot understand one domain isolated without understanding the other domain and without understanding the assumptions and the term of the conversation that has been set up by the enunciation. Let's take the example of philosophy, or let's take the example of science, or let's take the example of theology, and you will understand what, and we can take the example of art, and you will understand what I mean. So, to finish the second part, and then we go to the third and last part. Well, actually, no. I am still in the first part, and I talk a lot, so I have to, to accelerate here. So what is decoloniality? That is why I was telling you a story. And what is the difference between decolonization and decoloniality? So decoloniality doesn't aim anymore to build the state or to take control of the state. So the Zapatistas have been saying it for a long time, you keep the state, we have better things to do. And that is very important for what we are doing here. For Cosmopolis and the questions that many of us, if you are here, we are interested in, how to think without the state. How to get used to and act accordingly, that we cannot expect anything from the state, from the corporation, and from the banks. Forget it. So what do we do? And I think it's very important to think without the state. What can we do is, I mean, when you tell people to think without the state, it's like you just kind of pull away the security blanket. I mean, what I'm doing, and it's the state is protecting me. The state is not protecting us. The state is using us as far as we are useful. But the dispensability of human life is one of the key elements of coloniality hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. And what is the dispensability of human life? And I would say the dispensability of life. So you can think about slavery, the Atlantic slavery. That is the initial moment of dispensability of human life. And enslaved Africans who are not considered human, when they are not useful anymore to produce wealth, so or they got sick in the middle of the Atlantic, they throw it in the Atlantic, because if you take it to land, you have to pay insurance, you have to take care of them, etc. So life becomes dispensable to benefit economic growth. And that continues until today. Lives are dispensable, and that is mixed with racism. Of course, the lives that are dispensables are racialized life. And you can look around you, and it's all over. But in the 18th century, a new branch of dispensability of life emerged with the Industrial Revolution. And that's why we have ecological problems today. The Industrial Revolution was built with non-renewable resources. And now, well, you see what is happening. You see what's happening in the Middle East. Why the war in the Middle East? Because the oil and the gas is below the sand, and that is a place where the Belt and Road would like to go, and that is a place, etc., etc., etc. So everything is concentrated on gain and political power, and who pay the consequence is something else. So that dispensability of human life is one of the key consequences of the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality that comes together. So we say it's our assumption that there is no modernity without coloniality. So when Anthony Giddens said a few years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, from now on is modernity all the way down, we say, well, nous sommes tous foutus, parce que modernity goes with coloniality. So if modernity is all the way down, coloniality is all the way down. So decoloniality then is the analytic of the colonial measure of power, yesterday and today, to understand how it's controlling us. And the second goal of decoloniality is, Quijano said it in that short article, is epistemic reconstitution. And epistemic reconstitution means we cannot decolonially keep on thinking with the category of the West. Like, I mean, you see what postmodernity did. I mean, when they were running out of fuel, they began to find things in the West, like St. Paul and Spinoza and all this kind of thing. But that is already a closed door. So that is the difference between coloniality and colonialism, and the difference between decolonization and decoloniality. Decoloniality is epistemic reconstitution, but this epistemic reconstitution in order to not resist, but to re-exist, to begin to imagine and live without the state being at the same time. So that is my first part, and I realize that I will be brief here in the second part. In the second part, it relates because I was asked to address decoloniality and ecology, and not trying to follow them, but trying to delink for them. So when you look at ecology, you realize immediately that ecology comes from that this kind of Western civilization. Everything starts in Greece. Literature starts in Greece, and philosophy in Greece, and ethics in Greece, and politics in Greece, etc., etc. So I am not endorsing that, and I'm kind of showing you decolonially how the discourse of economy and ecology has been built and still kind of enforced today in the West, but also expanded in the planet, but coming from the history of the West. So ecology and economy have the same source, oikos, oikology and oikonomy. One is a discourse of, and both refer to the household, the administration of scarcity, the order of the things. But look how an economy also. And look at the year in which these words enter into the kind of the rhetoric of modernity. But we have forgotten now that ecology and economy have the same root. We have forgotten that for the Greek, ecology and economy didn't have the same meaning that it has for us today, right? In which ecology is, on the one hand, the study of the relationship within the human and the environment, and economy is no longer, since Adam Smith, is no longer the administration of scarcity, but is how to gain more. Remember the title of Adam Smith, The Wealth of the Nation. So economies in the 18th century comes a discourse to kind of articulate benefit, economic benefit. And ecology began to emerge late as a science, but independent of economy. But the problem we have today with the crisis of the environment is precisely because of this kind of separation, because ecology and economy have been separated, going in different routes, and forgotten the kind of the basic root of communal organization that this world has in ancient Greece. So today, what the kind of the textbook is presenting us the science of ecology in this scheme. So when we talk about ecology and everything that is eco, we just talking about land and people who live in the land. So I think that we should be, in this scheme, we should be talking about biology. Biology literally the science of the discourse on living, the discourse on life. So, and that is what is the problem now, because the way that the kind of the colonial mixture of powers work is such, and they give you one example, that until 1945, economy was part of society. From 1945 on, society is part of the economy. And I think that the last telling example of this is Trump in the United States. I mean, Trump is the the paradigmatic example of business taking over the state. So the society belongs to the economy. So that is kind of brief decolonial perspective on what ecology means. But that is, I don't want to talk about that, I want to forget about that. It all depends from where you start. And I am not starting from ecology. I mean, I am telling you how the discourse on ecology and economy are going on in the rhetoric of modernity, but that is not my game. I start from some place else. Where do I start? I start from the South American Andes. That is, in the map, you see the extension of the Incanate. The Incanate is what is commonly referred as the Inca Empire. But there was no empire in Incas. It was an Incanate because the ruler was an Inca. You imagine that you say that Julius Caesar was an Inca, they will be offended, right? So, but the rhetoric of modernity homogenizes, and everything is empire. Is the Ottoman Empire? No, it was not an empire. The Ottoman was a sultanate, right? And so on and so forth. So the Persian Empire. The Persian was not empire. It was a Shahanate. The Shah was the kind of the ruler. So the Incanate. So that is the Inca domains. So the Inca domain have a unity I don't have here, that is the Ayllu, A-Y-L-L-U. The Ayllu is a minimal unit of the organization of the four suyus. So what you see in the diagram, in the Colasuyo, etc., those are four suyus. And the four suyus, each suyus was formed by Ayllu, which is very similar to Oikos. And in the Ayllu is the kind of extended family, is the kind of the relationship with the universe, with the sky, the trees, the animals. So the Ayllu is not just the human, the Ayllu is the family of living organisms. The living organism I live with, right? Then the Ayllus was grouped in marcas, and the marcas in suyus. So each suyus have the same kind of a structure, and they kind of organize the life, the governance, the economy, they're talking about our terms, according to this kind of model, cosmological model, but social model. Cosmological model, why? Because Tawantinsuyu, you know, all the cosmology from China to the Incas, why the China was kind of all under heaven? Well, it's all under heaven, right? Everything that lives under heaven, that is our life too. We are part of that life. So for this model this form was modeled on the Southern Cross. Well, in the north you cannot see the Southern Cross, right? So why the Inca should kind of model their society according to some kind of constellation in the north? But that is what Amerigo Vespucci saw. And when Amerigo Vespucci saw that, he said, well, we are not in India here. I don't know what it is, but this is something else. Because he was keeping on going south and south and south and land and land and land, and he began to see that the sky was no longer the sky of Italy or Spain. So from the Southern Cone, the Southern Cross, they derive the Chacana. And the Chacana is for the Andean civilization, like the cross for Christians. So this is kind of the sum of everything. Everything is organized around the Chacana. And the Chacana is fixed, but in Indian cosmologies, but it's also in all kind of cosmologies of the indigenous cosmology, space and time are not fixed. So Kant doesn't have any place there. Kant cannot be understood because Kant kind of isolated and intersected, and he took movement away. But when you are looking at space and time, and you see that the sun and the season and all that, you see constantly movement. So time and space cannot be fixed. So the Chacana serves to that, and and that is the conception of life in kind of, again, Western term, organized around the Chacana, is life at the center. So the goal is harmony, is equilibrium, and is life. It's not gain. It's not domination. There is something to talk about here because what I say, but the Incas were dominated. Yeah, well, we leave that. This is what happened today. Today, the kind of indigenous philosophy are kind of reinvesting ancient philosophy into this kind of. I have to go quick because I have been talking for an hour, and I hope to finish in another 5 or 6 minutes if you are patient enough. What is today, we don't talk, we now in South America and also decolonially, we don't talk about ecology. Yeah, we can talk about ecology in the sense that we relate to the discussion of coloniality, but decolonially, we don't care about ecology. We care about Sumac outside, or Sumac Amanya. And what does it mean? Amautai Wasi, on the first hand, Amautai is knowledge, and Wasi is the house of knowledge, his house. So Amautai Wasi was a kind of institution that they call it pluriversity, the Quichua of Ecuador, to kind of revamp indigenous philosophy and indigenous knowledge. So the decolonial struggle is a struggle for knowledge, because in affirming a different kind of knowledge, you affirm a different kind of subjectivity, and you begin to think about a different horizon of life, not depending on the state, not depending on the bank, not depending on the corporation. So, for in this scheme, as I said, we don't talk about cosmology, we talk about Sumac Kausai. You see, Kausai is there at the center. And in the previous, you see that at the center is life. And here you have Kausai, that is knowledge. Well, obviously, because living is knowing and knowing is living. If you don't know, you die. And if you are not alive, you cannot know. But knowledge and life are the kind of destination of a kind of university that they organized. And the 4 years of the university, they call it pluriversity, was to form people of wisdom. People of wisdom, meaning the kind of the linking from all the kind of the concepts and beliefs and assumption of modern discourse. I would like to, instead of me telling you that, I would like to show you a video where a Quichua himself explained that. Because when I talk about that, I am not an anthropologist. When I study Aristotle, I am not studying Aristotle or Kant as an anthropologist. I am studying Aristotle or Kant because, I have to think through, I am thinking through them. So this kind of cosmology and philosophy is what inform my own thinking, my decolonial thinking, now that I am not indigenous, right? So let me bring this. Everything I said, he will say it in his own words, but I was preparing you to understand what he said. This is anthropologist who kind of sharing with us an interview he did with this Quichua from Ecuador. And after that, I will conclude.
Bueno, con respecto al pensamiento o visión, o la cosmovisión de los pueblos indígenas, se basa en base a este símbolo, que es un símbolo no simplemente de los pueblos andinos. Se ha encontrado este símbolo en diferentes culturas, también como en los mayas, como también los samis, como también los hindús. Más o menos este símbolo es un símbolo universal sobre la concepción, sobre la visión del mundo. Es decir, que aquí, o sea, no es fragmentada, no es desarticulada, o sea, la concepción en este caso. Por ejemplo, aquí en idioma quichua sería lo que es la parte espiritual, ¿no? Lo que es el muna. Muna, que es la parte espiritual. Y acá es lo que representa, o es esas son dimensiones, es decir, cada uno de estos son 4 dimensiones. Esta dimensión es el Muna, que es la dimensión espiritual, y esta es la dimensión que sería político y organizativo. O en otras palabras, en quichua esto es la parte, lo que es ati. Y aquí, esta dimensión de acá es en cambio lo que es la parte productiva. O economía. Y en quichua esto es rural. Y esta dimensión de acá es lo que sería para Occidente, lo que sería la parte de conocimiento. Conocimiento o educación. Educación puede ser ciencia. Y desde el mundo quichua, esta es la parte de yacha. Y cuando en el accionar mismo, esto no en nuestro comportamiento, ya en la parte ya del entorno natural, todo esto no se actúa de manera separada, sino al mismo tiempo se interactúa, se interrelacionan estos. Cada uno se interrelaciona. Cada uno se interrelaciona y cada uno se complementa. Y no es por separado. Entonces, esta es la dimensión. Toda esta interrelación se concreta en lo que sería suma causa. suma causa. Quiere decir que esto es suma causa en la parte central, la generación de estas dimensiones da como resultado suma causa. Quiere decir es el desarrollo o realización de la vida plena. Entonces eso, al menos eso se concibe y así se concibe al mundo. Por eso es lo que para nosotros cuando hablamos de la dimensión o de la concepción o el concepto de desarrollo, para nosotros no existe. Entonces, por eso, al menos no es cuando también hay unos dibujos que son de esta manera. Pero no sé cómo se puede ver cuando yo estaba hablando sobre el tema del ñaupa. El ñaupa no es que es una cuestión plana así, ni tampoco es una cuestión así, sino que es un sentido así, que va así. Entonces por eso es que está generando permanentemente, se rota así. Entonces al mismo tiempo está proyectando el futuro, pero al mismo tiempo revisa lo que ha pasado. Entonces ñaupa se puede utilizar en dos sentidos. El ñaupa, adelante, futuro, pero el ñaupa también es el pasado. Por ejemplo, cuando pronuncian nuestros mayores, dice ñaupa taita, quiere decir que personas mayores que pasaron. Pero al mismo tiempo, eso es lo que da la proyección. Entonces, en este caso, cuando yo estoy presente aquí, yo estoy en la mitad. O sea, no es que estoy pasado atrás, ni tampoco estoy adelante. Entonces, ese es el punto. Por eso, para nosotros, no existe un pasado y un futuro, sino hay al mismo tiempo, es simultáneo el proceso que se da. Entonces, por eso, cuando habla de subdesarrollo y el desarrollo, quiere decir que desde la concepción occidental, cuando dice es el subdesarrollo, son los que están hombres que todavía falta desarrollar para el futuro, que son pasados o falta evolucionar, ¿no? Entonces, a eso como concepción de subdesarrollo. Para nosotros, por eso, no existen esos conceptos, esos términos. Eso es lo que yo explicaba. El otro sentido también, si es que desde esta concepción partimos y con estas dimensiones, prácticamente no se trabaja pensando que vamos a superar pobreza o vamos a superar un subdesarrollo, sino es un marco interrelacionado en sentido de que todas las dimensiones se interrelacionan. Es decir, que desde el occidente trabaja simplemente más en esta parte de la economía, de acumulación, de producción, del capital financiero. Entonces, no tiene sentido. Es decir, que elimina todo lo que es la parte espiritual. Se desarticula prácticamente de todo lo que es la parte política, orgánica, y aún peor todavía de la parte educativa. Entonces, este es el problema que a nosotros nos genera entender muy difícilmente. O sea, es muy complicado para nosotros entender en el sentido de que hay que desarrollar. Pero está hablando solamente desde un sentido de la economía y no de su integralidad, ¿no? Para nosotros, si es que aceptamos el concepto de desarrollo, no simplemente tiene que significar el tema de la acumulación o en los ingresos o bienes materiales, sino el desarrollo tiene que ser eso en su integralidad, en dimensión total de la persona. Entonces, en ese sentido, por eso yo no me siento ni subdesarrollado ni pobre, porque yo tengo mis saberes, tengo mi cultura, tengo mi comportamiento, tengo mi entorno, tengo mi territorio. Entonces, yo no sé de dónde a mí me pueden calificar de que soy pobre, soy subdesarrollado, soy atrasado. De nada, prácticamente. Entonces, desde la cultura nuestra, nosotros hemos de saber, lo fundamental es buscar el suma causa. Esa es la parte, el deber esencial, el deber profundo del sentido del ser humano, de la persona. Y también, pero entendido de manera colectiva, de manera comunitaria. O sea, no simplemente una persona. Porque una sola persona aislada no puede tampoco hacer una vida o hacer suma causa. No puede realizar la vida plena, no puede alcanzar eso. Por eso cuando hablan de pobreza, desarrollo, cuando el Banco Mundial, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo y todos los demás, las ONGs, cuando están desarrollando, hablan simplemente de desarrollar esta parte, simplemente esto, de los ingresos, ¿no? De que mejore el salario, que tenga mejores ingresos en la familia, con eso para dinamizar la economía o el mercado, es decir, que lleva al mercado y no para trabajar en este sentido. Entonces, por eso es lo que yo desarrollé y había expuesto este concepto. Y ese es el trabajo que estamos haciendo, incluso desde aquí como institución.
Well, that is the point to let me just a few minutes. So the colonial nature of power is the analytic of how the colonial nature of power controls us. But the question, when we look at ecology and capitalism, etc., yes, we have to resist, but we cannot spend all the energies of our life resisting. The question is to re-exist. And that's what Quijano talks about epistemic reconstitution. Because we cannot re-exist remaining in the kind of the Western epistemology and Western control of subjectivity. So what this video gives you is an idea of how they are doing it. They are not critiquing ecology or capitalism. Yeah, they are, but at the same time, they are more concerned about how can we rebuild to live in plenitude. So the summa causa in knowledge, and so that is the horizon of a kind of decolonial delinking. Delinking from what? From the colonial nature of power. And you cannot delink from the colonial nature of power all at once. Each of us is responsible for our own decolonial liberation. But at the same time, as he said, that cannot be done by one person. That has to be a communal, not the commons, not the common of the Marxists, not the common good of the liberal, the communal. And the communal is rebuilding the kind of fabric of the communal that modernity destroyed and keep on dismantling and destroying. So that is basically it. I don't have time, but I was just bringing some example. I don't know if you're familiar with Rebecca Belmore, an Anishinaabe artist, activist, etc. That is in the last documenta. So he's talking to nature in the thought. And here is very revealing also, where she builds a kind of artificial cement tent in the middle of nature. So that is how the kind of indigenous artists are kind of responding both at the critique of kind of ecology and capitalism, but also kind of advancing their own reconstitution or re-emergence, as they say. Lina Simpson is also Anishinaabe, and she's an activist, she's a writer, she's a singer, and she has this book and record, Islands of Decolonial Love. Now we are entering at the end in a very interesting terrain. So talking about love, she has a wonderful article, Land as Pedagogy, not the physical science as pedagogy. I say, wow, how you bring a Buddhist here in this kind of postmodern 21st century age of artificial intelligence. How are you talking about Indians? You're talking about love. You're bringing a Buddhist. Okay, point taken. I bring you a scientist. Umberto Maturana, biologist, neurophysiologist, Chilean, talking about biology of cognition and biology of love. Only love can expand, only love expands intelligence. So the collective intelligence that we are talking about in the Cosmopolis has to be introduced, the question of love, because the collective is not enough. The collective could be competitive. And love is the negation of competition, and the competition is negation of love. And competition is the soul of the modern society. So how to get ahead, how to be first, etc., etc. So only love expands intelligence. To live in love is to accept the other and the condition of his existence as a source of richness, not as an opposition, restriction, or limitation. So there is a lot of people talking at this moment about love, but not about love, not the colonial love. And the colonial love is precisely what theology and liberalism perverted. So colonial love is one of the consequences of the failure of that the institution and the rhetoric of modernity has with kind of marriage of people of the same sex. So that is the perversion of love, that the decolonial love is respect, is care, is cooperation, is ethics, is responsibility, is working together. But for working together in this way, you have to delink from the colonial measure of power. It's not easy, but once you know it, you can do it. And you do it every day and every minute, because when you enter in this kind of thinking and doing and feeling, you see coloniality, as my students say, all over. You say in the store, you say in the television, you say, oh, look about coloniality in your everyday life, and they will just pop up. So, final comment, summary. I have to read this. That's okay. So to conclude, what should not be okay. To conclude, what should not be expected from the state, the corporation, and the banks. So this is the emerging political society. The emerging political society shall not be confused, although it's related, because one can belong to both, to the politicization of the civil society. What is the politicization of civil society? Indignez-vous. Indignez-vous, that is the kind of what do you call it, the intifadas and the the movement in Spain and what is the name? I don't remember. So the politicization of the civil society is the moment in which the middle class realize that it's losing privilege, and so they take the streets. So that is good, but the emerging political society is something, can be that, but also kind of began to organize our life in our own way. And in order to organize our life in our own way, you have to know. But to know, that doesn't mean that you have to go to school or have to go to university. The peasant way, la via campesina, they know. When they talk about globalization, they are more interested than David Harvey, with all respect to David Harvey, because David Harvey is kind of talking about globalization through the books. When Zapatistas are doing what they are doing, they are knowing. And they didn't know from the book, they learned. So that is the constitution of the political society. And knowledge, as I said before, is what controls us. So the question is the struggle. The struggle is from the linking and rebuilding knowledge that no longer comes from Greece and Rome and Heidelberg. So learning from what the rhetoric of modernity is about, implementing and hiding the logic of coloniality. We have to understand how this is controlled. Decoloniality aims at the linking from the colonial measure of power to relink with earth, with land, and the energy of living life in harmony and plenitude. That is what summa causa means. And that is the goal, the destination. the linking from the discourse on rhetoric of ecology and economy, and relinking with Sumakausai, Mino Bimadiwizim, which is a kind of Nishanabek word that means exactly the same that Sumakausai. And so relink with another existing philosophy that had been shattered by Western modernity, living in harmony and plenitude, re-enchanting the world that was disenchanted in the second modernity, the Enlightenment. The D of decoloniality presupposes the re of relinking, to re-exist in the search of living in harmony and plenitude. I know many of you might think, many people think, well, this is good, but how can we do that at this time? Well, if you think that you can go with the discourse to the meeting at Davos or the G7, or go to Trump and say, we have a good idea to live in harmony, well, forget it. So this is relevant if we are taking our destiny in our own hand and begin to know and to do research, not to advance the design, not to advance the design of kind of westernization or re-westernization, but to advance our own project, interest, and desire. Again, it's not easy, but it's doable. A lot of people are doing it. Just look around. So thank you for your patience. I kind of talked a lot.
Thank you so much, Walter, and thank you all. We have about 5 minutes, so somewhere close, so we'll have to leave it. But if someone would like to ask a question, we do have time for one or two. Let's see.
Thank you, Walter.
Yes, I don't know what the speakers are. I cannot understand.
Excusez-moi de poser une question en anglais. I am a little bit aware of the way in which Summa Causai it was attempted to incorporate it into the new constitution of Ecuador in the early years of the Rafael Correa regime, which in a sense is attempting a marriage between Summa Causai and a European model nation state. What is your perception of the success or otherwise of that attempt?
Thank you very much for the question. It's very important to clarify that. We cannot expect that the state, the kind of the colonial major power, will let us people do this kind of thing. They will kind of always appropriate. So when the state appropriated, it's a politic of the state. What I show you is the politic of the people. One thing is the minister or the secretary of decolonization that Evo Morales and Linera created, but decolonization cannot be a state project for the simple reason that the state manage, and decolonization is people liberating themselves and organizing themselves. So I think we have to be attentive to that the state, but because the state co-opted that doesn't mean that we cannot keep on doing it in a different direction. And that is what is going on. So indigenous people in Ecuador, in Bolivia, they are advancing their project, critiquing Correa and Evo Morales, because they are the state. So that's why I said thinking without the state. That is very, very important, and it's very difficult. That's one thing. The other thing is important in your question, that Summa Causai now is not only kind of co-opted by the state. The Constitution, the half time I can refer to that. But Summa Causai is being used by non-indigenous intellectual and activists, like Gudillas, Acosta, etc. And they are using it because Summa Causai give them a new tool to critique development. When the guy said, how they want to develop us? They want to just develop economy, but no. Life in plenitude is longer than that. When the non-indigenous intellectual and activists use summa causae, they use it to critique development and democracy. Kind of holistic conception of causae, of living in harmony and plenitude. So that is very important. It's not that the non-indigenous intellectual discourse is irrelevant, but we have to be also aware that the non-indigenous intellectual can no longer speak for the indigenous people, because the indigenous people are speaking for themselves. And in some cases, there are collaboration between non-indigenous and indigenous, and in other cases are not. So we have to be aware of all these kind of intrinsically, so to speak. But at the same time, if we believe that summa causae give us a horizon of life, take it and work it and critique the state and the link from the state. So that's my comment on that. And my fight also, because I have been writing and talking about this guy. Oh. I will take two and then...
Je préfère vous poser la question en français.
Essayez, si je ne comprends pas, je demande.
Ok. Donc c'est intéressant quand le personnage de la vidéo parle sur la construction à niveau du collectif et que vous avez repris ça comme la nécessité en fait de repenser aussi à la communauté. Il me paraît que c'est un problème grave aujourd'hui moi j'ai du mal à savoir à quoi correspond ce niveau de la communauté, puisque l'État-nation est un modèle de communauté. Quel est donc le modèle de communauté sur lequel on peut travailler ensemble?
Quel est le modèle?
Oui. What is community?
Wait. Oh, okay. There was another question?
Seulement ça.
Thank you very much for this talk. I agree with you what you have said, but I have a certain problem. And one of the let me explain my problem is that when I was looking in your matrix of power, I was a bit astonished that there is no technology. That technology is not part of that, and that made me think of that because you are dealing with a huge question, which is the question of totality of knowledge and so on. But of course, this knowledge can only be spread from the west to the east to the other places through technological advancement. So these technologies is not only what transmit this knowledge, but also sustain this knowledge. So that was what I was a bit surprised that the discourse may remain an idealist discourse. Now, what related to this is when you talk about a return to cosmology, and I think this is very important, and what you says about the epistemic reconstitution. But what can we imagine about a kind of new geopolitics, or even a new cosmopolitics that can emerge? Let me give you an example. So if you do you suggest that these different cultures should withdraw from the participation of the global economy in order to develop their own cosmology or their own community? You know, it is like what in the 70s when Samir Amin said that the third world countries should withdraw from the world economy. Is that what you are saying? But if it is the case, we have another problem because now this return to cosmology is in contrast to what in the West, what is happening in the West with the competition of exploration of space and so on and so forth. And how can we imagine a kind of new globalization in this sense?
Okay, so I think that both are connected because the model is their own model of the communal. It's the model of the communal that comes from thousands of years. That is the model. So the Chacana, the explanation that this guy gives, is the kind of the foundation of the reorganization of society, the organization of society in the search of summa causae left to live in plenitude. Lina Simpson is one of the advocates in Canada of, she called resurgence. Resurgence means to make the way of life of the indigenous people resurge today. Knowledge and education, so she kind of works in two worlds. So she works, because she's a scholar, but also she works with the community. And in the community, she's learning from the elders, not from, so that is the model that they're kind of, not the goal to invest our own way of organization at this moment. That is what is going on.
Mesdames et messieurs, il est bientôt 21h. Le musée ainsi que les expositions vont fermer. Nous vous prions de bien vouloir regagner la sortie. Demain, le centre ainsi que les expositions ouvriront à 11h. Nous vous remercions de votre visite et espérons avoir le plaisir de vous accueillir à nouveau très prochainement. Ladies and gentlemen, the museum and exhibitions are about to close. We invite you to proceed to the exit. Tomorrow, the center and the exhibition will open at 11. Thank you for your visit.
I think that, so quickly, I think that the difficulty you have is because modernity was so successful in erasing this way of living that remain for 500 years, remain kind of shaken up, but now they're kind of reconstituting that. So your two questions, I think the second one is related to this. But the first one, I didn't put ecology there in the colonial benchmark because I put nature, sex, and race. And I didn't have time to explain how these three concepts work together in the rhetoric of modernity because there is a correlation between two things. There is a correlation between certain people like the African with nature and also women because of the regeneration of the species. They are kind of related to. And secondly, something I didn't talk about, nature is a noun. Is a noun in the West reduced the tremendous diversity and beauty of life and living into one concept. And then Bacon said, well, nature is there for men to know and control it. So nature and sex and race are three concepts that work together, and ecology is related to that. So if I can expand that, so the question is to get out of the concept of nature, because nature kills, and that's why we have still nature in the painting of 19th century, right? And the second one is, I think it was also your question, how they can live under the state. He doesn't talk about state, he talks about governance. So the politics of all the indigenous people from the Mapuche to the First Nation in Canada, to the Maoris in New Zealand, to the Aboriginal in Australia, is the same, and they are all connected. So the question is the reconstitution of their knowledge, the way of living, coexisting. And that is something I didn't talk either, that we say that the colonial is not a mission, it's an option. It's not a mission because we are not going around to convert people to decoloniality. It's an option. Why? Because once you said that decoloniality is an option, everything else is an option. But what happened is that there are certain options that became hegemonic. And that is the problem we have and we are fighting for. So decoloniality in that sense is a totality also. But I mean, the question here is, I'm saying an option is, when you say that decoloniality is an option, you say that also that we believe with many other people in truth in parentheses. But Western epistemology, from theology to science to philosophy, kind of talk with the conviction of truth without parentheses. And truth without parentheses is war, because or you agree with me, or I kill you. And truth in parentheses means that I have my truth. Sorry, but this is what I believe. But I have to know that you have your truth. And that is where love comes into the picture. Love comes into, you are a person and you have your truth. So let's go together, let's live together. So there are many totalities, but there is one totality that is hegemonic, and that is the kind of monopolar order, not just politically, but also epistemically. So there is so much to talk about here.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm sorry. And as we have really spoken up to the last moment, and guards who've been here all day like to try and leave on time, could you also make your way out? And we can talk at the bottom of the escalator. We have a little bit more time, but they closed this space